My dad was a pastor at a church for 4 years. Many people had died in this church before we got there. Over the course of these 4 years, some of the craziest, most unexplainable stuff had happened. I'm here to tell you all a few of the best ones. My parents went to Maine every year. I had gotten tired of the trip and decided to stay home. I went over to the church to grab some snacks from the back of the old sanctuary. There were 2 sanctuaries. One was about 90 years old, and the newer one was about 50 years old. I went to the back of it, where the snack booth was. Mind you, this was the middle of the day, so it was completely lit up through the old stained glass windows. I bent down to grab some drinks from the mini fridge under the counter, and when I got back up and turned to walk out the door, I saw this figure standing in the doorway. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, no ears. Just a bald head wearing a long dark robe. As soon as I saw it, it vanished like that. Safe to say, I ran out of there as fast as humanly possible. Another time my cousin came over to spend the night at my house. We wanted to play PS4, but the other controller was over in the church. So, we walked across the yard into the church. It was pitch black outside. When we opened the door of the church, we might have made it 2-3 feet in before we heard the loudest blood-curdling scream. We ran out of that door and back into my house so fast. My cousin was on the verge of crying and saying he was never going back to that church again. The church had a preschool in it. They would change out the toys in the classes every now and then, so the kids wouldn't get bored of the old ones. One time, the teacher took one of the kids upstairs to help her pick out some toys for the rest of the class. These old classes upstairs were used for storage of preschool toys, extra chairs, old desks at the time, so there was no one else up there except these items. When the teacher was grabbing some toys, the kid she brought up to help said, "Hey, look at those kids playing with those toys over there." When the teacher looked over there, no one was there. Several years ago, I had an opportunity to help restore a 100-plus-year-old church that had been vacant for roughly 45 years. The church was attached to what once was a primary school that had already been restored into office spaces. This was a no-brainer, since it was literally a couple of blocks away from my house. The job was to be paid under the table, and the responsibilities were incredibly easy. Since the church had been empty for years, we only worked during the day since the electrical system had yet to be installed. But during the days I would work, I'd always see movement in my peripheral vision, but nothing was there when I looked in that direction. This happened a lot to the point where I'd become accustomed to it. This all changed a few months later when the building became operational, as we converted the church into an event hall designed for any event you'd pay for. Well, after business hours one evening, I got a call from a tenant saying that something was making noise in the basement of the church. Since the power hadn't been installed into the basement at this point, I made sure to grab my brand new charged flashlight and keys to see what was happening. As soon as I got to the basement door, I could hear what sounded like power tools running. I went in and started making my way through a pitch-black labyrinth of a basement towards the noise. I found the cause of the noise, which was an air compressor. I know they bleed air at times, but I made sure I bled all the air before I left earlier that day and unplugged it. I looked to see if someone plugged it in after me, and it was still unplugged. At this moment, my brand new flashlight started to flicker, and another unplugged power tool turned on behind me. When I turned around to shine my fainting light at it, the light went out completely. I hauled ass out of the basement through complete darkness towards the door. I got out and saw the tenant standing at the door with a puzzled look on her face. She asked what was wrong as I'm out of breath and freaked out. I told her what happened, and she smirked and said that didn't surprise her. She has lived in the neighborhood her entire life and tells me that as a child, she attended school and church. She then told me a story of a woman who held the last wedding in the church before it closed down. It was a sad story because the woman was stood up on her wedding day and ultimately committed suicide because of it. After that night in the basement, paranormal activities happened more and more often. It got to the point where a coworker fell off a ladder. This ladder was always secured, and he'd been up and down it 100 times. When I asked what happened, he said it felt like he was pushed while leaning to paint. There were even times where the movement I had always seen in there started to take shape. Instead of a blur, I started to see a person standing there, but nothing when I looked in that direction. What finally pushed me over the edge was the night I guess you can say I met her. Since events were always held there, I'd always lock up afterwards. After an overnight booking, I ran into the guests as they were leaving. A gentleman asked me if there were any other people in the building that night. I said no, as we make sure the office part of the building is vacant during overnight bookings. He proceeded to tell me that he heard yelling from the basement and footsteps on the balcony. I assured him they were the only ones there and began to lock up the building. As I'm locking the doors, I hear faintly what the gentleman was referencing. I could hear footsteps in the balcony, and I yell out, "Is anyone still in here?" I did not get an answer, but at this point, I am ready to go. What I hated most about locking up was the light switch was nowhere near the door. So, you would have to shut off the lights and then walk about 30 feet to the door in darkness. I shut off the light and immediately sprinted towards the door. As I reached for the door, I heard footsteps behind me and a muffled voice say, "Leave." I didn't stop to see what it was. I made my way to the glass entry doors and to the other side as fast as I could. As I'm locking the door, I see movement inside of the church. I look up and see a ghostly or shadow-like figure standing where the altar once was. I quickly look down to ensure I locked the door, and by the time I look back up, the shadowy figure was now making its way to the glass doors. I honestly don't remember if I locked the door or not, because I immediately got the hell out of there at that point. After that night, I made sure I never entered that building after dark again. Needless to say, I quit shortly thereafter. So, for context, this encounter takes place at the 140-year-old church where I work as a pastor. Apparently, when the second floor was being built in 1976, a worker fell through the roof and landed on a girl who was sitting in a pew during the service, resulting in both of their deaths. As one of the two pastors, I must go to the church every late Saturday night to prepare for the services, at the same time as the cleaning crew. I used to not believe in ghosts until these encounters convinced me otherwise. Anyway, this first story isn't too freaky, but it's worth mentioning because it will make sense for the other stories. Down in the basement of the church, there is this weird storage room area accessed by a padlock. In this room, there are doors leading to other rooms, including the water heater and the piping. One of these rooms leads to a hallway about 5 feet wide and 40 feet long. This whole hallway is filled with old chairs and pews. Anyways, one day I went down there to grab a chair because one of the chairs upstairs broke, and at the other end of the hallway, there is just a man standing there. Now here is the weird thing. The only way in and out of that room is through the locked door to the hallway, which only the staff members and I know the code to. He didn't look like a staff member, and unless he climbed over the chairs, there was no natural way he could have gotten to the end of the hallway. I called out to him, Then he just vanished. I later checked the security camera footage. There is a camera in every room because of a lot of recent robberies, and he had been there since the start of the footage, which was at 8 p.m. the day before when motion was detected. I didn't open that door until around 9:30 p.m. the day after motion was detected. So, it made no sense. Now in this next encounter, it was with the same man, but another ghost was involved too. This takes place on the second floor. A few weeks after the previous encounter I explained, I was there at around 10:20 a.m. preparing for church service, which starts at 11, and I had to grab something from the kids' art storage room. When I first got upstairs, I saw that same man standing in the room at the end of the hallway. I went over, and when I got within 5 feet of the room, he vanished again. I went into the room, and then as I walked in, I heard what sounded like a little girl who whispered the words, "You're mine." And the door started to slowly close, and the lights started flickering. Let's just say, this terrified me. I darted out of the room, which I'm pretty fast when I'm scared, and I literally jumped down most of the steps on the stairs and ran outside. Later that night, when I arrived at the church to clean, I looked up in the top floor window and saw a little girl and a man standing at the window. They both smiled and waved at me, then vanished. After I saw that, I decided to head home after asking the cleaning crew to finish up, and I promised myself not to ever go back to the church at night. Now, these stories are creepy and all, but what I think is the creepiest part is that nobody else in the church has had any experiences like this. Most people have heard casual footsteps in the attic, which is unreachable for safety reasons, but nothing like this. Peace be upon you. I'm sorry, but this may be a very long post, and probably not as exciting as you'd expect. Thanks, Hollywood. I've been asked many times now, in responses and conversations in this sub and others, to share my experiences as an Order of St. John chaplain and demonologist. It's hard to know where to start, to be honest, but the most important thing I think is to say that these are my beliefs and experiences. I certainly don't begrudge you yours, and definitely don't want to assert any kind of authority over the beliefs of others. As chaplains, we are not positioned within a church because we minister to communities. It is not our place to judge any member of that community, but only to care for and support them in their needs. Also, rule number 1 of the job is to disprove, and disprove again. General and passive paranormal experiences are part and parcel of the job. I'll touch on it more later, but I'm not afraid of things that go bump in the night. I used to be, but once you've studied and understood it, the paranormal loses its excitement and becomes more of a puzzle that needs to be solved. My passive experiences are things like every month or so I'll have new knocking on our doors and windows, even though we live in a secure 3rd floor apartment. I get random prods and pokes when I'm by myself, whispering, murmuring, growling, scratching, electrical interference, random mists, distorted shadows, and shadow figures here and there. This has all become a weekly occurrence, although when I say that it's usually just one of these things that happens, I deal with it, and it goes away almost immediately. The hitchhiker is probably my most fascinating one, because it's a recurring event that happens every couple of months, and I haven't yet solved the puzzle. I travel a lot for my role. At the moment, I've been sent to one of our small towns to train people, run mental health programs, or help with large-scale crisis responses. This results in my driving for long hours, sometimes during the day and sometimes at night. I will see the same stocky hitchhiking figure walking along the side of the road in a black hoodie and jeans, with hood up, thumb out. I've never stopped, and he's never turned around when I've approached. I've seen him at every point in the day: dawn, day, dusk, night. I've seen him in locations several hours' drive from each location. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but hitchhiking is uncommon in our country because we're small and buses are cheap. The howling is another recurring one, although it's newer. It's more annoying than anything else, to be honest. But several times my partner and I have been woken to a long howl in our bedroom. The cloaked figure is one that I've thankfully resolved, but had to deal with over a series of years. To cut a long story short, whenever I was in the middle of a really tough case supporting someone in what we call spiritual warfare, I'd get a visit from whatever this was. It was the same every time, where I would have a dream of a cloaked figure, wake up to a spinning room, and be choking. I've had sleep paralysis episodes before, but this was certainly different. I'm still half convinced this was some kind of sleep apnea issue. The only thing that makes me think it was paranormal is because it happened without fail when I dreamt of this figure, and it stopped after I put some intentional work into stopping it. That's pretty much it. I'm always open to helping people on here, so if you have trouble, please just reach out through a message. I'm also happy to answer questions and engage in discourse, although I'm not going to be entirely engaging in what-ifs from the stories. For me, it is almost impossible to prove the paranormal online due to the nature of evidence and how easily it can be faked.